When AMD launched the Ryzen 5000 series late last year, the 5800X was seen as the least desirable part out of the whole stack. However, after having used it for the last couple of months in my test bench, and seeing its price drop across multiple retailers while seeing the 5900X still relatively hard to get, I believe a good case can be made for why one should choose to go for the 5800X now. Let's discuss that in this video. Hey, if you enjoy content like this, drop a like, make sure to subscribe, and smash that bell so you never miss another video. Hey, what is going on guys? Danny here, welcome back to the channel and I hope you've all been doing well. In this video, we'll be taking a look at the Ryzen 7 5800X. Think of this as my late review of this 8-core Zen 3 CPU, although the advantage of doing a review several months after release is that you get to look at parts with a different set of eyes or perspective, after the initial hype or disappointment has settled down, and the market itself has gone through a few different changes. At launch, the 5800X was a CPU that didn't necessarily get the most positive feedback from the press due to having this part receiving a considerable bump in MSRP over its predecessors, along with that being $150 more expensive than the 5600X and only $100 cheaper than the 5900X, it put the 5800X in a bit of a weird spot. I'll admit, I was also in the camp that said that the 5800X was just too expensive, and I would have liked to have seen it released at $399 or $429 at least. However, the 5900X was extremely hard to get, and most often when it was in stock, retailers had it priced up significantly higher than MSRP. In today's PC hardware market, MSRP holds very little merit. So when people started to realize that buying a 5900X was quite the convoluted task, they set their eyes on the 5800X. Now with the CPU market starting to normalize and supply catching up, the 5800X has seen a considerable drop in price, where at places like Newegg or Amazon, you can find it for around $420, and if you live near a micro center, you can even find it for around $370, which is a really nice discount. So what I'll do is cut the preamble short, we'll do a quick rundown of the CPU specs, the test system specs, we'll jump right into the benchmarks, and then we can finally do a conclusive discussion. The Ryzen 7 5800X is based on the same Zen 3 architecture as the 5900X, built on the same 7nm manufacturing process from TSMC. I won't bother with an overview of the Zen 3 microarchitecture as I've covered that already in the past, so feel free to check those videos out. What differs this part is that it's got 8 cores with SMT that gives it a thread count of 16. It has a base clock of 3.8 GHz and a boost clock of 4.7 GHz. It has 32 MB of L3 cache, which is half the amount that you'll find on the 5900X, mainly because this is a CPU with a single CCD and not two. In terms of power, it's got a 105 watt TDP, but we'll go over power consumption in more detail later on in the review. With the CPU specs out of the way, I wanted to do a rundown of the test system that I used to test all these processors. All of the CPUs were tested on the MSI X570 Unify motherboard. I also tested the CPUs without Precision Boost Overdrive and Auto OC, as those are overclocking settings, and what we're trying to see is how the CPUs perform at stock. The CPUs were all cooled by a Corsair H159 Pro XT 280mm all-in-one liquid cooler. For the RAM, we've got 8GB sticks of Partriot Viper steel memory, which I had clocked at 3600 MHz with manually tuned primary and secondary timings, with the memory controller clocks equalized for a 1:1 ratio. For the graphics card, we've got an Asus ROG Strix RTX 3090. The storage devices are a 2TB Samsung 970 Evo Plus and a 1TB WD Blue SN550. Powering all these components is an EVGA 1000G3 80+ gold certified power supply. We'll first take a look at frequency behavior of the Ryzen 7 5800X. This will allow us to see how the processor operates under a given scenario, such as gaming, and help us validate the boost spec of the product, and whether or not it meets what's listed on the box. The first scenario we'll take a look at is Shadow of the Tomb Raider. This will allow us to see the boost behavior of the CPU in a gaming scenario, and one that is particularly thread heavy and can be CPU bound. Here we're seeing some pretty good figures, where all of the cores are hovering around 4.75 to 4.8 GHz, which is slightly above the stock boost clock of 4.7 GHz, and it seems to maintain this pretty consistently. This boost behavior is better than what we noticed with the Ryzen 9 5900X, as that CPU with its cores averaged a boost of 100 MHz less, but do keep in mind it has 4 more cores, and in a thread-heavy game like this will result in lower figures. Nonetheless, it was impressive to see the 5800X boosting pretty aggressively, exceeding expectations like this, and if this is any indication of its overclocking potential, then that seems promising. So get subscribed because I will be making a separate video exploring PBO2 and Auto OC with this chip. Now, another scenario that I wanted to take a look at for this chip was its boost behavior in IDA64. This is a pretty heavy stress test that loads up all the cores to 100%, and this kind of load is what you can expect out of a very core-heavy workload like video rendering or Blender. So here we're also seeing some pretty good figures from the 5800X, where the cores are hovering around 4.6 GHz for the most part, with some cores boosting to 4.6 GHz or above occasionally. It's impressive because in a workload like this, you're usually dealing with fairly high temps, and that can lower the overall boost, but even under these circumstances, the 5800X averaged some pretty good boost figures and near what it was advertised for, so it's excellent. Let's move on to thermals, where we'll first take a look at how warm the processor ran during a gaming workload using Shadow of the Tomb Raider. The 5800X turned out to be the hottest chip from the bunch. It's nothing drastic, but it's a measurable difference. It averaged 61 degrees Celsius and peaked at 69 at one point. Compared to the 12-core 5900X, that's a 5% increase in average temps, but do keep in mind it was also boosting higher too. Compared to a previous gen 8-core CPU, there is a noticeable difference between the two, about a 12-degree difference. So there is a significant jump there, but once you see the power usage figures, it'll make sense as to why that difference occurred. When we shift our focus to another workload like IDA64, where we are now dealing with a scenario where all the cores are loaded up to 100%, which puts much more stress on the CPU, we see higher figures across the board. Though the CPUs are all pretty much within a few degrees of each other, there aren't really any differences here that puts one CPU at a severe disadvantage over the other. In this workload, we can see the 5800X averaging around 72 degrees, which is fine and totally acceptable in a workload like this. Moving on to power consumption, we'll take a look at how the CPUs perform in Shadow of the Tomb Raider. Here we can see the average power consumption of the 5800X to be around 106 watts, which is close to the 12-core 3900X, so it's a little bit higher than where I was expecting it to be. Compared to the previous generation 3800 XT, that is a significant bump, an almost 36% increase in power usage, which is interesting considering that my 5900X wasn't that much more power hungry than my 3900X. So I was expecting the 5800X to be a bit more in line with the figures we saw from the 3800 XT. When it comes to IDA64, we obviously see much higher figures from all the CPUs, but just like in Shadow of the Tomb Raider, the 5800X is hanging around the same area as the 12-core Ryzen parts, and seems to be significantly more power hungry than the other 8-core CPU in this chart. So when it comes to thermals and power consumption, this is an area where I'll say the 5800X does acceptably in, but isn't particularly impressive when compared to the other parts in the chart. However, once you guys see the performance numbers, I believe you'll be able to overlook those higher demands from the 5800X. So speaking of performance, let's jump into our first set of benchmarks, and we'll start with the popular Maxon Cinebench R23. Here we can see the 5800X attaining the highest single core score out of all of the CPUs. The 5900X is only just a single percentage point difference there. However, compared to the previous gen 3800 XT, we see a massive 19% performance advantage. As for the multi-core score, the 5800X does pretty well here as well, sitting right in between the 3800 XT and 3900X, attaining a multi-core score of 15,836. It's quite impressive and puts it fairly close to the 3900X despite having 4 less cores. When it comes to CPU Z, here we can see a similar story as to what we saw in Cinebench. The 5800X attains the fastest single core score out of all the CPUs. In this benchmark, the 5800X has a 23% advantage over the 3800 XT when it comes to single core score and is 18% faster in the multi-core score. Looking at this from a gen-on-gen perspective, those are some very respectable gains for sure. Moving on to Geekbench 5, and it seems like we're starting to see a trend here, where the 5800X once again is the fastest CPU when it comes to the single core test. It also does quite well in the multi-core test, scoring 11,361, which is about 11% higher than the 3800 XT. In multi-core tests, the 5900X is still king, holding the lead at a staggering 14,830. PLV Ray is next, and this is another ray tracer benchmark similar to Cinebench, where the CPU is instructed to render out an image, and the score yielded here is in points per second. Here the 5800X is about 20% faster than the 3800 XT when we use all the threads to run the render. So that's excellent, and it becomes even more impressive considering the fact that it's closer to the 3900X in that regard. When it comes to single core performance, we noted a 22% increase, which is also a huge increase over the 3800 XT. Up next, we have PC Mark 10, which measures the system's performance in various scenarios and applications, much like Geekbench, where it does word processing, image editing, video rendering, video conferencing, etc., and then spits out an overall score. Here we see a very interesting result where the 5800X is actually very close to the 12-core 5900X. Here we're looking at a difference of around just 2%, compared to the previous gen parts like the 3800 XT and even the 12-core 3900X, we do see a significant difference. This is because this benchmark does various tests which rely on a combination of workloads from single-core and multi-core, but since it doesn't split up the scores like other benchmarks, the single-core results seem to heavily influence the final result. The last synthetic benchmark we'll take a look at is Corona Renderer. We'll first compare the time it took for each CPU to complete the render, and here we can see the 5800X took 82 seconds to complete the test, whereas it took the 3800 XT 97, so a drop of 15%, not too bad. When we take a look at the amount of race per second to see just how much is processed with respect to time, we see that the 5800X has a 19% advantage over the previous gen Zen 2 3800 XT, which is very nice. It's time we shifted our focus to some real-world tests, starting with 7-zip file manager compression. Here we can see that the Ryzen 7 5800X is about 22% faster than the 3800 XT, putting it closer to the previous gen 12-core 3900X, where the difference there is only about 7%. For a CPU that is at a disadvantage by 4 cores, that is an excellent result. Next up, we've got decompression, and Ryzen already performed really well in this regard. Here the 5800X is 18% faster than the 3800 XT, but it's not as close to the 3900X as it was in the compression test, where now we're seeing the two CPUs have a gap of around 22%. Compared to the 5900X, the difference there is about 42%, so this workload does show us that it scales well with multiple cores. Next up, we've got Vegas Pro 18, a very popular video editing program. Here we took a video game clip, rendered it out using the Magix AVC codec at 4K 60fps, and noted the time it took to complete the job. While Vegas Pro 18 can benefit from more cores to help reduce render times, it's clear that this program does favor higher single-core performance through higher IPC gains and clock speeds. This is evident as the difference between the 3900X and 3800 XT is 10%, whereas the 5800X beats the 3900X by 160 seconds or 16%. So clearly, despite having 4 less cores, the program seems to benefit from higher single core performance of the 5800X. The 5900X in this benchmark is the fastest CPU, but the difference there is only just 3%, so we're getting to the point of diminishing returns with respect to core count. Handbrake is up next, and this video transcoding program behaves differently compared to Vegas Pro. Here we can see the 3900X completed the export in 120 seconds, whereas it took the 5800X about 134 seconds, a difference of around 10%. So despite having a lower single core performance, the higher amount of cores are preferred in this program. Though you'd still benefit from the higher single core performance if you compare it against the other 8-core CPU, where the 5800X is about 8% faster than the 3800 XT, but it's clear that in this particular scenario, the higher amount of cores are beneficial. The last program we'll take a look at is Blender, and here we can see this program does prefer higher core count CPUs, as the 5800X falls 19% short of the 3900X and is more closer to the 3800 XT, where the difference is 13%. Compared to a 12-core part from the same generation, we can see the 5900X leading the 5800X by a whopping 27%, and in larger, more complex workloads, I'm pretty sure that gap would grow. So if you're someone who uses Blender a lot, then definitely go for the CPU with more cores. Let's finally move on to gaming. Now, I have benchmarked 18 games at 1080p with high settings, but I won't be going through every single title, just a handful to cut time short, as by then you'll have a good idea of how this 8-core Zen 3 CPU does against the other Ryzen parts. But I will be doing a 18 game average and showing a difference per game chart for specific CPU comparisons. Starting us off is Shadow of the Tomb Raider, and this title shows us some very impressive performance from the Ryzen 5000 series. Here the 5800X pretty much gives the same exact experience as the more expensive 5900X. Compared to the 3800 XT, it's about 36% faster, which is a very nice improvement. Up next, we've got Cyberpunk 2077, and here the differences amongst the CPUs aren't as profound, as this game is more GPU bound. Here the 5800X is able to deliver the same performance as the 5900X, and is 22% faster than the 3800 XT for the average FPS. The 1% lows also see a decent bump. Here the difference is around 21%, which will result in an overall smoother experience. Assassin's Creed Valhalla is an interesting title, as it pretty much shows us that even at 1080p, we're running into a major GPU bottleneck where the user wouldn't be able to perceive any differences amongst any of these CPUs in the bunch, so let's move on. CSGO still remains one of the most popular competitive Twitch shooters, and this is a title that is very CPU bound and relies heavily on faster single core performance, as evident here. You can see that both 3900X and 5900X lose to the 8-core Ryzen parts from within the same generation, because the 3800 XT boosted higher than my 3900X, and the 5800X also boosted higher than my 5900X, so those extra clock speeds are also advantageous here. With the 5800X delivering a mighty impressive result at 770 FPS average, what I will say though is that any of these CPUs in this chart would deliver a fantastic experience in this title, and hardly anyone would be able to tell the difference between the CPU running this game at 500 FPS versus 700. Unless they're rocking a 360Hz monitor and play this game professionally. Mountain Blade 2 Bannerlord shows us some very intriguing results. When I did my review of the 5900X, I thought that this game scaled off multiple threads. The difference between the 3900X and 3800XT was 18%, however now we're seeing that the difference between the 5900X and 5800X is just 3%. This leads me to believe that while this game will benefit from more threads and of course faster single core performance, this game would also benefit from the lower latencies of the 5800X, allowing it to perform closely with the 5900X. Forza Horizon 4 is next. This game is one of my favorite open world racing titles and visually looks fantastic. This game shows its skills well with faster CPUs with respect to higher single core performance. Here the 5800X is about 26% faster than the 3800XT when it comes to the average FPS, and is 18% faster when it comes to the 1% lows. So gen on gen, those are some very impressive gains. Red Dead Redemption 2 is a game that behaves very similarly to AC Valhalla. All the CPUs benchmarked here will virtually give you the same performance, so there's not much else to say beyond that. Borderlands 3 shows us that 5800X can match the 5900X when it comes to the average FPS. However, where the 12-core Zen 3 part is faster is in regards to the 1% lows, where we see a 18% difference. So that is a considerable gap and will result in smoother experience on the 12-core part. The last game I wanted to take a look at was Horizon Zero Dawn. Here what we notice is that the gap between the 3900X and 3800XT was around 8% for the average FPS, whereas the difference when comparing the 5900X and 5800X is only just 2%. Still, we do see that both the 12-core ports put up the highest amount of FPS when it comes to the 1% lows, though the 5800X overall would perform great in this title. Alright, now that we've gone through a few of those gaming benchmarks, it's time we take a look at the 18 game average. As expected, the 5800X and 5900X are almost neck and neck when it comes to the average FPS and 1% lows, similar to how the 3800XT and 3900X are. Comparing this 8-core to the previous gen 8-core, we see an impressive difference of 22% for the average FPS and 18% for the 1% lows. Therefore, this tells us that at 1080p, the 5800X would yield some noticeable performance improvements in the majority of titles. Looking at this from a game-by-game breakdown, we can see that there aren't any huge advantages that the 5900X has over the 5800X besides a couple titles, and at that point it doesn't matter too much as the 5800X would already be putting up some excellent numbers. So I do not recommend the 5900X if all you're going to be doing is just gaming. You're much better off buying a 5800X or 5600X and then putting that money saved towards a better GPU. I did want to point out though that we did see a few titles where the 5800X was faster, although not by a lot, but this is mainly due to the fact that those games are more reliant on faster single core performance, so the higher boost behavior helped the 8-core CPU take the lead. When we take a look at the differences between the 5800X and 3800XT, it's no contest. Zen 3 is overall much faster than Zen 2 when it comes to gaming, with the majority of titles showing us double-digit gains, and this is the result of Zen 3's architecture advantages such as having higher clock speeds, lower IPC, and more. So if you're someone who plays multiplayer games, especially competitive ones at 1080p on a high refresh monitor, then it might be worth upgrading to a Zen 3 CPU. Though that's not to say that the performance from Zen 2 is bad, it's just that if you want to ensure you're getting the most out of your GPU at this resolution, especially because you have a newer higher end GPU like a 3080 or 6800XT, then Zen 3 will fulfill that role beautifully. Well, I gotta say, I'm very impressed by the performance of the 5800X. It's got great multi-core performance for an 8-core CPU, and it's got excellent chart-topping gaming performance. Though I'm sure at this point nobody was denying this fact. It's just that what made people hesitant on purchasing this CPU was its higher MSRP. However, as I said in the beginning of this video, you can now find this CPU for considerably cheaper, being $150 more expensive than the 5600X and $100 cheaper than the 5900X put the CPU in an awkward position. If you were just after the gaming performance of Zen 3, it made sense to just buy a 5600X, and if you wanted to game but were after the great multi-core performance, then just pay $100 more for the 5900X. Or alternatively, if you're after great multi-core performance and you're okay with the performance from Zen 2, then the 3900X is also a great option. However, now you can find this 5800X for around $400, sometimes even cheaper than that depending on where you live. Here in Canada, the difference between the 5800X and 5600X is around $120 for the most part, but if you want to jump to the 5900X, that difference then grows to around $200 plus. Sure, you get 4 more cores, but I'd say it's really only worth it if you're going to be taking advantage of all 12 of those cores through heavy workstation and content creation tasks. However, I feel like if you're going after strong gaming performance of Zen 3 and want to maybe do some video editing and streaming on the side, then paying that extra $100 to $120 over the 5600X makes this part worth it. It's also just more of a personal preference of mine, but I'd just be more comfortable having an 8-core system versus a 6-core system in this day and age with just the way things are progressing. Also, compared to Intel, yes, the 5800X is still considerably more expensive than something like a 10700K and is slightly more expensive than the 11700K, though do keep in mind that for those CPUs you will have to purchase a Z490 or Z590 motherboard, and last I checked, the prices on those mobiles is quite high, which completely then diminishes those savings you'll get. Whereas with the 5800X, you can pair this chip with a cheaper B550 board and still get the most out of it, while also being able to take advantage of new chipset features like PCIe 4.0. The 5800X would also be an excellent upgrade for those rocking Ryzen 2000 or 3000 parts, particularly 6 cores or lower. You'll get a massive uplift in regards to single core performance and multi-core performance. AMD really has laid out an excellent upgrade path for previous gen Ryzen owners. There's just so many great options there. So I'll leave it at that. Now that the supply issues of the Ryzen 5000 series have been mostly ironed out and prices are beginning to slowly drop, I believe that this 5800X is in a much more attractive position than it was when it initially launched. So if you've been thinking about upgrading to a 5800X or buying one new for a build, then I'd say go for it.